Hi, everybody. Sorry if I seem to lack enthusiasm, but I just did a whole video recording of this and lost it because my computer just went kaputs on me. So let's see if I can do this again. All right, here we go. So we just finished our discussion of the transition to the modern age, and now we are ready to jump in and find out what this modern age looks like, at least from the European perspective. Okay, so Europe is going to be our focus. Okay, so by 1450, Western Europe was set to search out new opportunities, grow, and expand. So why is that? So generally speaking, right, what we know is happening in the 1100s and 1200s and 1300s is that Europe starts to undergo these changes in terms of agriculture and commerce and business. We know that all of this new information that's coming in from the Middle East, we know that all of these factors of the Black Death and declining population helped to move Europe along to a new model, right? A model that included a middle class with new investment money, new crops, new methods of agriculture, new opportunities in the countryside, new cities, right? And most definitely a monarch who would be willing to support it. Now, of course, depending on where you are, we determine which monarch you're talking about, whether it's the Tudors or the Valois monarchs or Isabella and Ferdinand. But the fact is that the monarchs see opportunity in economic growth, and so they're going to encourage it, okay? And so that's what we're really setting out to do here. So you'll see that this particular slideshow is posted for you down below this video. And so by all means, you can go ahead and look at these slides after we're done here and go at your own pace. Just realize that we're not going to get through the entirety of the slideshow. We're only doing a piece of it here, and we're going to pick up with it tomorrow doing our lesson, okay, during our live session. What I want to talk to you about right now, though, is this thing we call the Renaissance, what this is, right? Because this is a term we talked about when we discussed the Hindu Renaissance. The Hindu Renaissance and our understanding of what's happening in India in the classical age actually borrows that term Renaissance from Europe in terms of scholarly pursuits, right? Specifically, the term Renaissance was first used to describe what was happening in Europe during this period. By definition, the term Renaissance means rebirth. And there was a historian named Jacob Burckhardt who in the 19th century was studying Italy, right? Italy, which was, of course, at the center of this trade. Italy, which was divided into all of these smaller kingdoms and duchies most often and city-states, but definitely at the center of what's happening in Europe at this time period with all of this information and all of these goods coming in. And it was Burckhardt, who was often referred to as the father of cultural history, who just decided to look at what was happening here, not through the lens of just political reports or political documents, but to look at multiple sources, especially artistic sources, which Italy had a wealth of them from this time period. And it was through his study of this that he got a better sense of what was happening here. What I'd like to do is share with you an excerpt from his famous work that attempts to deal with what's happening in Italy at this time period. And if you would just bear with me, I want to read it to you because I think it really speaks to what's happening here, okay? So I'm going to stop in the middle of it, but try to stay with me and read along. So he describes Italy during the Renaissance as both sides of human consciousness. The side turned to the world and that turned inward lay, as it were, beneath a common veil, dreaming or half awake. The veil was woven of faith, childlike prejudices, and illusion. Seen through it, world and history appeared in strange hues. Man recognized himself only as a member of a race, a nation, a party, a corporation, a family, or some other general category. Right? He's talking about what Europe was like during large parts of the Middle Ages. He's talking about the individual, the European, being childlike, right? Not questioning what was around them, kind of accepting things as they were, kind of half out of it, right? Dreamlike. Okay. But then he goes on to say, it was in Italy that this veil, right? The shadow, essentially, first melted into thin air and awakened an objective perception and treatment of the state and all things of this world in general. But by its side and with full power, there also arose the subjective. Man becomes a self-aware individual and recognizes himself as such. And you'll notice I highlight that because I think that's the key. look, everybody, to study the Renaissance in Europe is a huge undertaking, right? If some of you, your senior year, opt to take AP Euro, I can tell you firsthand when I used to teach that class, it was enormous, right? You felt like you had so much to cover. There is a lot of evidence. There is a lot of things, a lot of developments happening in that time period. It can be overwhelming. But what I found is if you study the individual and the changing mindset of the individual in their entirety, as opposed to feeling like you have to memorize every tiny little detail, you really speak to the true importance of the Renaissance, right? Listen, you can take an art class. You can go spend the rest of your life learning all about the Renaissance masters, and that would be fascinating. I think I would love it, right? But the fact is, when we're in a survey class and we're in a world history class, what we're looking to do is understand why it's a significant period in the history of human beings. And what I'm telling you here, and what Jacob Burckhardt is telling you, is that human beings changed. Their mindset changed in Europe at this time period. Europeans of the Middle Ages were not the Europeans of Renaissance Italy. There was a shift, okay? And that's what we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on that shifting mindset of the individual. I would also, though, before we go into some of those examples, like to point out to you that there are some other historians who are a little critical of Burckhardt. And not that they say Burckhardt's wrong, but they kind of, I think, add more to this time period with their interpretation. So let me just share that with you. So Peter Burke is another historian whose big criticism of Burckhardt was that he seems to talk about almost like, like the veil melts into thin air, like this light switch going on. And Burke is basically arguing that Burckhardt is oversimplifying it. His claim, as you can see indicated in red here, is that it's incorrect to think of the Renaissance as a singular event. And he actually points to the fact that a lot of the Renaissance, or the time period he calls the Renaissance, is still very medieval. Right? I bring this up because next year, when you're in 10th grade, you'll talk about 1750 as the next major turning point. And in 1750, you have industrialization, and you have modernization, and you have the emergence of democratic governments and revolutions. And you start to realize that some of the things that they were fighting for in that period were finally trying to get rid of some of that continuity that held over from the Middle Ages. Right. And so keep in mind that not all things medieval disappear. There's still that's going to be hanging around. And to that end, Wallace Ferguson, I think, also adds another reminder here then that the Renaissance should really, in large part or very often, be considered a transitional period more so than a sharp corner, right? I use that expression today, and I know with one of the classes, right? It's not, history doesn't often turn sharp corners, right? It's really about this kind of transition, this evolution to the next time period, okay? So let's just keep that in mind as we move forward, right? But as we move forward, what I want to do is I want to talk about what I believe to be the most important factor in this change taking place in the individual European at this time period, okay? And that change is humanism. By definition, well, humanism is hard to define, but what it is really best described as a philosophical movement, okay? It's a way of thinking. And I know that's probably hard to kind of get your mind around, like, what does Ms. Carroll mean by that? But if I say to you, think about the way in which Confucianism as a belief system really shaped Chinese society for thousands of years, then I would say to you, humanism really does the same thing for Europe in the modern age. There's a lot of things that are humanist that are very much a product of our society still today. Not the least of which is, look at the root word. The root word is human, right? It really puts great emphasis on the power of the individual, right? The subjective individual. And so, to be more specific, Petrarch, who is an Italian thinker of the 1300s, first is very often referred to as the father of humanism because he really is believed to have kind of taken up this cause that he was inspired by the classical writers of the past. So the literature, right? It was a literary movement. The classical writers of ancient Greece and ancient Rome really inspired Petrarch. He's living in Italy. He's, surrounded by Greco-Roman remains, and he's digging out the works of the writings of the classical age. And he's thinking, wow, we have a lot to learn from these guys, right? And it's this inspiration from these thinkers who advocated for self-awareness. Think about Socrates for a second and Plato, right? About innovation, about curiosity, about questioning, right? It was these things that Petrarch found that modern Europe could learn from. And in this way, it really challenged scholasticism, which had guided Europe in the early stages of its return to education in the late Middle Ages. Let me kind of restate that so I don't lose you here. We know that in the aftermath of the Crusades, or in the midst of the Crusades, because it would last for hundreds of years, in the midst of the Crusades, as new information is coming back from the Middle Ages, from the Middle East, that Europeans are drawn to new learning in a way that they hadn't been since the classical age. And so you did have universities in Europe in the 1100s and 1200s, right? And these universities very often were organized by the church because they had the resources to do this, and they were the people who were interested in education. And scholasticism was the philosophy that really guided education in these universities. The best way to describe scholasticism is an approach that is deductive, meaning that you argue from the point of some accepted truth, that you are presented with something that you are expected to believe is true, and to work your way backwards to an understanding of how to prove that truth. And so this scholasticism fit church teachings perfectly, because church teachings, of course, were based on faith. And so these elements of faith very often, along with certainly the works of the ancients, inspired this learning. And there was brilliant individuals who were products of a scholastic education. St. Thomas Aquinas, as an example, right? The school down from TZ that is named for him, right? He was a brilliant learner and intellectual, and he was a product of and contributed to scholastic thought. But it was humanists who, by the 1400s, who were agitating, who were saying, you know what, maybe we should be looking towards inductive reasoning. Maybe we should start to think of human beings as the agents of new truth, as the vehicle to find truth through hypothesis, is what inductive reasoning is, right? Through hypothesis, through testing. And so these humanist learners started to appear in these small academies, these schools all throughout Italy, and gave rise to a movement that would take over Europe. And this movement, as you can see from this slide, shows itself in art, in social behaviors, in civics, in religion, right? Of course, religion's eventually going to have a question for this, which we'll get to. What I want to do right now in the time that I have left, which may not be a lot here, is talk about the artistic movement. Okay, and the artistic movement might be the one that you're most familiar with. So let's start with one of the most popular pieces to come out of medieval Europe. Okay, this is from Michelangelo, of course, very famous, probably the most famous artist, painter, sculptor, right, of the Renaissance, a real Renaissance man. And this work is called La Pieta. And when you first look at it, right, the subject of this work is very Christian. Okay, and so you would say, okay, this looks very medieval. It's Mary, the mother of God, right, with her grown son, Jesus, who after his death, she's cradling him, right? So this is a very popular subject in Christian beliefs. And so you look at this and you say, well, yeah, okay, I guess it's inspired by classical age, right? It kind of looks like it could be Greek or Roman, the sculpture, but the subject is very Christian. And that's true. But here's the real unique character of La Pieta, which really speaks to the humanist component. And that is the human quality of Mary, right? Look at Mary for a second. In this image, Michelangelo wanted Jesus to be the size of a full-grown man, right? Which is how old he was, which is when he was crucified. But how do you have a mother cradle her grown son? In order to do this, in order for you, the viewer, right? To feel sympathy for Mary, to feel the emotions of Mary, and to see Mary as the mother, Mary needs to appear enormous. Look closely now.